Today's kids would probably not know that actors like Christian Bale and Matthew McConaughey were once part of B-grade popcorn flicks. No, don't get me wrong, Reign of Fire was a solid entertainer. And to be honest, it still bothers me that Rob Bowman's mythical story about fire-breathing beasts is so underrated. Sure, Bale and McConaughey weren't huge stars at this point, but they were pretty well known, and their performances were amazeballs. Not to mention Bale actually speaking like a person born in Wales. Yet, Reign of Fire holds a lowly 41% on Rotten Tomatoes and a Metacritic score of 39. In fact, the underwhelming reception from audiences and critics essentially ended the movie's reign. So what actually went wrong? I mean, was the plot bad? Or was Reign of Fire simply doomed because it didn't make enough money and Hollywood scrapped it? Let's find out. I'll be upfront with you. Reign of Fire might not be classified as our all-time favorite dragon movie, courtesy of Dragon Slayer or Dragonheart. In fact, animated movies like How to Train Your Dragon may very well surpass Reign of Fire. Yet Bowman's film saw a brilliant build-up of a dystopian world and was filled with striking visuals. In fact, the maker went out on a limb to give us memorable sequences overcoming a number of difficulties. Let me give you an example. When it was time to design and build the dead dragon, the task fell on Artem, with visual effects to be carried out by Secret Lab. However, with the prolific show of scaled creatures in movies like Jurassic Park and Lake Placid, they realized something. The surface, which was usually made by layering painted textures over displacement maps, gave the model a strong look, but when it had to move, the scales stretched and shrank, giving it a rubbery look. Bowman decided to eliminate such flaws and used the then groundbreaking works done by Neil Escuri, the digital effects supervisor on Disney's Dinosaur of 2000, as a benchmark to create realistic physical movements of the dragon. The computer graphics professional and FX technician Carlos Gonzalez Ochoa stated that the film required 100-foot or 30-meter creatures with wingspans of 300 feet, that's 91 meters, that could undergo enormous speeds and accelerations. The artistic direction required each dragon to have wings that transition between a variety of physical behaviors and interact with the environment. But even after doing this, Reign of Fire failed to capture viewers as much as the team expected. Before I get into what went awry, let's first check out the narrative. So the story kicked off in 2002. Young Quinn Abercrombie was visiting a London underground construction site with his mom Karen, the project engineer. It seemed like a pretty normal day until it absolutely was not. The workers cracked open a hidden cave, and of course, we saw a dragon waking up from hibernation who incinerated everyone. Quinn was the only survivor who lived through the trauma of his mother dying while protecting him. The dragon escaped, and eventually it turned into a global nightmare when more dragons started appearing. The militaries of the world got involved and threw everything at them, even nukes. But oh boy, nothing seemed to be strong enough against the fiery brutes. Ultimately, civilization collapsed, and humans were pushed to the brink of extinction. Fast forward 18 years to 2020. The dragons started dying off, but those who lived got increasingly aggressive as food ran out. Quinn was now a grown man who, along with his best friend Creedy, was leading a community of survivors at Bamberg Castle. His plan was simple: do not try to fight. Instead, wait and see until they hibernate. However, he also had a plan B. Quinn was quietly grooming a young orphan named Jared to take over as leader. Things, however, started getting messier when supplies fell short and the group sneaked out to harvest crops early. Invariably, they attracted a dragon that burnt most of what they had. Quinn, Creedy, and Jared managed to drive the dragon away, but thanks to the dodo, Eddie and his followers, the community was left with no food. Enter the Americans in an armored convoy, led by Denton Van Zandt, a guy who clearly had a death wish and the firepower to back it up. Van was played by Matthew McConaughey, who was almost unrecognizable behind all the sweat and a hermit beard. Quinn initially thought that they were marauders, but Van Zandt earned his trust by revealing the dragon's key weakness: poor vision at twilight. Soon they started working together and slayed the dragon who ruined the harvest. Then Van Zandt introduced Quinn to Alex Jensen, his helicopter pilot and intelligence officer, and laid out the real mission. It went something like this. After killing hundreds of dragons, Alex realized every single one was female. Her theory was that the entire species relied on one male to fertilize all the eggs. So all they had to do was track down that male dragon in London and kill it so the dragons could no longer reproduce. Quinn suspected it was the same dragon that killed his mother, but he still refused to join them. He knew that London was crawling with dragons, and if they failed, the dragons would follow them back to their shelter. But Van Zandt was determined. He went against Quinn and started drafting some of the castle defenders and headed to London. Exactly as Quinn warned, the Mail found their convoy and wiped out everyone except Van Zandt and Alex. Oh no, he wasn't being polite. He tracked them back to the shelter and then attacked. Quinn got survivors underground, but they were trapped when the dragon returned, and sadly, in that second attack, Creedy was killed. Quinn has now had enough. He handed the castle over to Jared and joined the hunt. They flew to London and found the Mail there among hundreds of females who were now so damn hungry that he was cannibalizing his own kind. That scattered the females and left the Mail alone, which was perfect for Van Zandt's plan to split up, bait it, and ground it with explosive crossbow bolts. Once they were at close range, they would put one down his throat. It almost worked, but the dragon detonated the first bolt early with his own fire breath and swallowed Van Zandt whole. Quinn and Alex regrouped to lure the dragon back down, and finally Quinn fired the last explosive straight into its mouth. Done. 3 months later, no dragons. In the end, we see Quinn and Alex putting up a radio tower overlooking the North Sea. Jared showed up with news of French survivors asking to speak to the group's leader. He then told them that Jared was the leader now and turned his attention to rebuilding. I'm not saying Reign of Fire had a novel story idea or something. To be fair, it's a pretty standard post-apocalypse movie, but the idea of dragons causing the end of the world is so cool that it made the whole thing way more enjoyable than it normally would be. And the way Bowman treated the apocalypse aftermath stood out to me. You don't really get to see continuous splashy actions where hordes of dragons are being fought off with countless tanks and airplanes. Rather, the frenzied, dragon-driven destruction of the entire world is conveyed entirely off-screen, using a montage of newspaper clippings. There's another idea in Reign of Fire that really impressed me. In a lot of fantasy movies, especially from the 80s, you get this concept where the ancient world was actually the far future after some massive disaster eliminated modern technology. What's interesting about this film is that it shows that transition happening almost in real time. As I said, the story was set around 2020, where people were fighting dragons with bows, axes, and whatever they could find, along with the occasional machine gun. And somehow, it still felt believable because these were people who actually lived through the collapse of the modern world. I guess I've established that the story and acting was pretty much great. But what made the critics raise their eyebrows? Well, for starters, at its core, the script had only one thing going on: this clash of wills between Quinn and Van Zandt. Beyond that, the characters felt pretty thin. No one really came across as fully developed. Not even Van Zandt's second-in-command, Alex. You would expect her to stand out more since she was the only major female character, but nope, nothing. You see, Rob Bowman at that time was famous for directing episodes of The X-Files, and I guess his head was still with his television experience because I can't help but say that at times, the movie felt like a really polished TV episode. There were a lot of medium shots, and almost everything had this industrial gothic lighting style that looked fine, but didn't always make sense for what was actually happening. It also seemed like Bowman was not really interested in the quieter moments, because he clearly rushed through dialogue scenes to get to the more intense parts. Unfortunately, he failed to realize that those were where we were connecting to the film. The slow tension when no one knew where the dragons were, cut to full-on panic when they realized the dragons were right there. I'm no seasoned critic, but if these things icked me out, I can only imagine how blatant they were for the film reviewers. Sprinkling salt on that wound, Roger Ebert gave the film 1 out of 4 stars and said, "The movie makes no sense on its own terms, let alone ours, and it's such a grim and dreary enterprise." Reign of Fire still managed to bag the Best Visual Effects Award in 2002 at the Sitges International Film Festival in Spain. And yeah, that kinda checks out. From the very first we laid eyes on the fire-breathing beast and those colossal wings in the scene, it made an unforgettable impact. Well, now we're clear on the script side, so let's see what happened during production, which gave Bowman and the unit a hard time. Firstly, the screenplay for Reign of Fire was originally written in 1996 by Kevin Peterka and Greg Chabot, but it saw the light of day only in 2002, and in his review of the screenplay, Christopher Weiner stated that the script went through numerous rewrites and the draft he was discussing was dated August 29th, 2000, which was Matt Greenberg's revised version. It was thus unclear how much of the original script was left. That means, right off the bat, they were dealing with a movie with multiple writers whose creative vision got lost in translation during the 4-year process of reworking the first draft. In fact, when Bowman took the job, he had no idea what he was walking into. He went in thinking he was going to make a dragon movie and wanted to put regular people against the overwhelmingly superior opponent, in his own words. But, as I said, he was extremely methodical when it came to bringing the dragons to life. Apart from using Neil's designs for ideas, Bowman turned to reptiles and insects found in the wild to design the physical appearance of the scaly dragons. He revealed that the biggest inspiration was the king cobra snake, and mentioned there had to be some relatability to the various predators that exist. The skin had to be the same skin as you would find on a king cobra, with a little texturing, let's say from an alligator. And if we bring in the dead dragon again, the features on the giant shown here, as it lay lying down in the end moments, you know for a fact how serious he was about the design. The other influence on the dragons of Reign of Fire came from the bombardier beetle. The insect is known for having 2 chemicals in its abdomen that come together to create a scorching hot spray used to kill prey and fend off enemies. We don't need an Einstein brain to realize that this idea clearly influenced the dragon's fire breathing. Bowman also blended physical traits from animals, like Komodo dragons, elephants, lions, tigers, and even sharks, to create something that felt both realistic and terrifying. Say what you want about the overall movie, but the dragons themselves were pretty badass, and honestly, still hold up even 20 years later. I know they didn't actually show up all that often, and got probably around 15 minutes of screen time in a 100-minute film, but whenever they did, it counted. I mean, there's a reason that Reign of Fire's dragons actually influenced the ones in major projects like Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. Reign of Fire began principal photography on February 19, 2001, with a hefty budget of $60 million, and wrapped by July the same year. The next obstacle was when the production planned to shoot scenes in Ireland's Wicklow Mountains. It seems like fate was testing them, because a sudden outbreak of foot and mouth disease, the first of its kind in almost 40 years, put large parts of the UK under strict quarantine. Yet Bowman and his crew somehow got special permission to film in the area. The catch was simple. They could use the location, but only if they caused no damage and cleared out all sets and props immediately after filming. As a result, many scenes had to be snipped out from the filming schedule. For those unfamiliar, foot and mouth disease is a highly infectious viral condition that affects cloven-hoofed animals. It causes severe fever and painful blisters in the mouth and on the feet. The 2001 outbreak in the UK was huge, with around 2,000 cases, over 6 million cows and sheep affected, and a serious blow to both tourism and agriculture. And now we know, to Reign of Fire too. After roughly a year of post-production and editing, Reign of Fire finally hit theaters on July 12, 2002. The film opened at number 3 at the US box office, pulling in around $15.6 million in its first weekend. Not a bad start, right? But things quickly went downhill from there. Despite that decent opening, the movie was met with mostly negative reviews and struggled to maintain momentum. A few months later, it ran straight into a wall with the release of The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. Obviously, Peter Jackson's movie went on to gross nearly $1 billion worldwide. Compared to that, Reign of Fire barely stood a chance, and by the end of its run, the film had earned around $82 million worldwide. It was quickly labeled as a financial disappointment, and somewhere, in the end, Reign of Fire got overshadowed by a far bigger cinematic giant and faded into the background. Today, it's remembered as a forgotten release, or a cult classic at best. And that, my friends, sucks. Yes, I agree the film had its flaws, but it met with a far more brutal fate. On top of that, once you realize how serious Bale and McConaughey were about their roles, I'm sure it'll break your heart too that Reign of Fire could not rule the box office. To prepare for his role, a pre-Batman Christian Bale initially had a very different approach in mind. He thought of going into full machinist mode and losing a significant amount of weight, believing Quinn should look physically worn down, given the harsh and resource-starved world he was living in. Good idea. But soon he had to change his whole schedule. Once Bale saw the physically imposing presence Matthew McConaughey brought to the role of the Dragon Slayer Van Zan, he understood that he had to build a stronger physique of his own to match Matthew on screen. And Bale spent days and nights working out to bulk up. Also, don't think that all the effort was just to come off as a believable counterpart to Matthew. During the final confrontation between Quinn and Van Zan, both actors got so immersed in their performances that they reportedly ended up landing real hits on each other while filming, including the moment where Van Zan accidentally headbutted Quinn. Matthew McConaughey, too, went full method while working on Reign of Fire. He reportedly insisted that everyone on set referred to him as Van Zan throughout the entire production. In his 2020 book Greenlights, McConaughey even mentioned that he shaved his head for the role because he was already losing his hair in real life. Co-star Alex Sitting, who played AJ, recalled a pretty hilarious moment while speaking to AV Club. The first AD came into the trailer where we were all having our makeup and stuff done and said, "Guys, I need your attention. Mr. McConaughey's going to arrive on set in about 15 minutes, and you are not to call him Matthew or Mr. McConaughey. You must call him Van Zan." And even outside the set, in town, anywhere, you had to call him Van Zan. The actors literally gave their blood, sweat, and tears into this film, but in the end, its success was measured by how much Reign of Fire could fill the producers' pockets. And though a sequel was in their minds, it never got the chance to materialize. Yes, the talks about the follow-up movie were a real deal. In an interview with Movie Hole back in 2002, Christian Bale talked about the next part, stating, possibly, "I told Scott Matter, who plays my stepson in the movie, that he's well positioned to take the sequel from me because of the way the movie ends." So yeah, we did not get a Reign of Fire sequel ever, but in 2002, Kuju Entertainment released a Reign of Fire video game for all the major platforms of the 6th generation. However, like the movie itself, the video game too received somewhat middling reviews. Also, its legacy persists to this day, at least to an extent, because even when it was getting bashed left and right by some critics, others, like Elvis Mitchell and Richard Roper, appreciated it for being a fun B-movie. Mitchell noted that the movie might have been a minor classic if it had maximized its own possibilities. But until the rush wears off, the picture is as much fun as a great run at a slot machine. Even when your luck runs out, you're only losing pocket change. I never did see it in the theaters, but when I watched it on television for the first time, I was completely captured by the story. Even when I rewatched it later, I found some extra little perks, like this scene where Gerard Butler and Christian Bale pass the time by acting out Star Wars scenes for the kids. It's the way the film managed to bring such a soft human layer to an otherwise dark and gritty story that will always have my heart. But circling back to the question with which we started, what the hell happened to Reign of Fire? The answer is quite painful. It was one of those productions that went through a lot of trouble behind the scenes, like constant changes, an unexpected epidemic, and some unwise cinematographic choices by the director. I guess it's commendable how it still held together, but I guess it's commendable how it still held together. Sure, the final product was not exactly a home run, but you can't really ignore this movie, like Chandler snapping his fingers, you know? And that's the interesting part, because in spite of all its flaws, Reign of Fire managed to leave a bit of a mark because you can undeniably see its DNA in the bigger and better projects that followed. In a 2017 interview with Vice, Bowman recognized that Reign of Fire made its mark on pop culture and honestly didn't mind others borrowing its dragon designs. To quote him, "It's okay, it's a compliment." So now that you've got the full picture of what went into Reign of Fire, let me ask you again, what is your all-time favorite dragon movie and why? Do let us know in the comments below, and if you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!